Thank you all for coming. This is concurrent session F, Pearl S. Buck and Social Change 1. We also have another concurrent session on Pearl S. Buck and Social Change. We have three presenters in this session, and as we have been doing, I will refer you to the biographies in your packets to read about the presenters, and for the sake of time, I will simply introduce them. They'll come up and speak. At the end of all three presentations, we will have some time for questions and comments. So if you have any questions or comments that you think of during the presentations, please hold them until all three speakers have completed their presentations, and we'll give you a chance. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, and that's Ann Kaler from Gwynedd Mercy University and the Pearl S. Buck Writing Center.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored, I think, to have the person with the longest possible title. The good news is I'm not going to sing, because the title is The Cockeyed Optimists and Careful Dreamers, How the Artistry and Optimism of Pearl Buck, James Michener, and Oscar Hammerstein changed America's awareness of Asia. And we think it did. In 1957, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, three neighbors were chattering about a recent issue of racial prejudice that had happened in their neighborhood. Their ambitious solution was to address the problem by writing a book on the subject. The triumvirate, as they called themselves, had all fought previously against racial prejudice, especially, and social inequality within their own writings long before they thought of issuing a book. Well, the book never got issued. It never got in print. Hammerstein did. He was the one that was called the Careful Dreamer. His companion, Richard Rogers, who wrote with him, gave him that title. Did write a satiric essay, Dear Believer in White Supremacy. Michener, who followed the war as a journalist, was going to write on Prejudice is Wrong. Pearl Buck did write an essay called The Effect of Prejudice on the Individual. Now, even though the book was never published, those three artists shared among themselves, and the group of artists that lived in Bucks County at that time, the humanitarian views, and that's what I want to talk about today. Hope for the future, trust, eventual trust in mankind, and optimism. Unabashed American optimism, the belief in the future. The lyricist and poet Hammerstein immortalized that particular brand of optimism or hope in his song from South Pacific. A cockeyed optimist who is immature and incurably green, stuck like a dope with a thing called hope, who can't get it out of her heart. What a wonderful line that is. Now, how did this happen? For this, we need a little bit of background. You know that Pearl Buck bought the Green Hills Farm, where Pearl S. Buck International and the Writing Center are right now, so that she and her husband could raise children in a setting similar to her home in West Virginia. In 1941, Oscar Hammerstein also came down from New York, bought a home, settled his family there, and they're still there, by the way. And Michener was the only Pennsylvania native, but he bought a farm up in Pipersville. So they actually were in a triangle, but they consider themselves the triumvirate. Besides being good neighbors, the three of them had written about social issues and racial inequality before. In the 1930s, of course, Buck did it with The Good Earth. In the 1940s, Muchner did it with his Tales of the South Pacific, following the American military on its way over to Japan. By the 1950s, Hammerstein was well established in the theater, and it's much easier, and this is the thesis, if you will, of the paper, to understand social issues when they're presented in live theater with live performers and spectacle and costumes and animals if you need them, and music and dance and pretty girls and all of that. So the theater is really, especially with its music, what brought the prejudices out in the open. Hammerstein had an earlier hold on that. As early as the 1926 operetta, The Desert Song, he showed the inequality between the heroes, the French, and the black Arab and Arabian riffs, R-I-F-F, in those songs. In 1927, in Showboat, taken from a novel by Edna Ferber about the Oklahoma area, the Mississippi-Missouri River area, he had taken that and put into it the character of Julie and her lover. Julie is half black. There's a prejudice in the South about marrying. They could not be interracial marriages. He handled that by having the couple break up because they were not allowed to be married. And she sings the song, "I will love one man till I die, can't help loving that man of mine." He also touches the racial inequality with the slang, if you will, of the black worker in Old Man River. So he has shown his presence with the issues. However, it was in 1943 in Oklahoma where he took Lynn Riggs' drama, Green Grow the Lilacs, and presented America right in the middle of the war. Now, a personal note, I saw that on its first out-of-Broadway run in Philadelphia. 8 years old, my second introduction to theater, and a man dies in the end of it. Luckily, I slept through it, and I had to have my mother tell me later that night. I was 8 years old, what did I know? But he has in that, and I have a whole lot written here, he has in that what has become an all-American song, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." Well, remember that, Pennsylvanians. It was written in Pennsylvania. And the corn that's as high as an elephant's eye, which it is never that high in Pennsylvania, knee-high if you're lucky by the 4th of July, that was written, and the birds swooping around were written in Pennsylvania. On the other side, but we'll overlook that. He wrote and made famous Oklahoma, somewhat overlooking the fact that it's about the rush, the Sooners into Oklahoma, and the Sooners were people who wanted to continue toward the west to get good land, displacing the Native Americans who had been moved there after the first wave knocked the people out from the Appalachians. So he couldn't do everything all in one song, but he did try. Now, as far as the three artists go, Pearl Buck had dealt with racial prejudice much earlier. She dealt with so many of the social issues. One of them was mental disability in a child. She kept that from us for 20, 30 years. I remember again when that was published too. And it came out in the A Child Who Never Grew, the famous book. But it's also in, of course, The Good Earth with the little fool character. So it was something that was constantly on her mind. So it turned into children who are unacceptable for one reason or another. A side note, when she was 4 or 5 years old and would go out and play with the Chinese children, they wouldn't play with her because her hair was golden and she frightened them. So the ama, or her mother, I'm not sure which, devised a black cap to wear. Solved the problem. They never looked at her blue eyes, I guess. But it was an interesting solution. Hammerstein centered his courage on the love story. This is in South Pacific now. Of a middle-aged man who claims that he's in love with Nellie Forbush. But the subplot there between Lieutenant Cable and Leot is the center racial prejudice. Again, it's white versus black, or a different shade. And it's condensed in that wonderful song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. You've got to be carefully taught to hate. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. Notice, he doesn't say what shade. So to all of us who don't have the same complexion that we have, everyone else looks different. That song was so controversial, they weren't going to cut it out of the show. They tried their best to cut it out of the show when it went south. And they wouldn't, Hammerstein and Mr. would not permit it. And Mr. made the comment that that was the finest moment with Rodgers and Hammerstein, that they kept that song in. The song surprisingly ends and with a verse that most of us don't really know. Love is quite different from hate. It grows by itself. It will grow like a weed on a mountain of stones. It can live on a smile or the note of a song. And that's how they popularized part of the racial prejudice problem. Now, why does Lieutenant Cable fall in love with Leah? This is in both the story and in the musical that they made from it. Mitchell was interested in giving to the American public a view of what military life was like during the war years, of the rigidity of military life, and again being against war as they all were. Each of the three writers had a sense of being an outsider. We know what Pearl Buck's outsider was. She lived for 40 years in China, learned in Chinese before she learned in English, and so forth. What we don't realize is that Hammerstein was an outsider also. He was one that broke the rules in American theater. He took the operetta, the most favorite part of the operetta, and turned it, that and a review, which had dancing girls in it, melded it together into what we now call musical comedy or musical drama. That period lasted from about 1943, just about 1957. Again, I saw the show in Philadelphia, the first West Side Story, which is definitely racial prejudice. It happens to be between the Irish and the Italians, Puerto Ricans. But it definitely social inequality, all of that, but racial, some kind of racial injustice. In America, Buck was the outsider, as we know. As Peter Kahn says at one point, she was governed by a secular version of the missionary impulse she had inherited from her father. Using that, he thought all of her writing was frivolous and never read a book of hers, ever. And yet it is in her books that we learn about racial prejudice. Peony is an example. Peony is the example of Jews in China, in one of the southern Chinese ports. So she has handled that in other books in other ways. How did she operate it? All right, she started early with prejudice. Her first work was East Wind, West Wind, which has a Chinese man wanting to marry a white woman. His mother, being a traditionalist, opposes it on the reasons of refusing to acknowledge any son of a racially mixed couple as a legitimate member of her family. If it's a girl, of course, it will be of no consequence. That was the mother's viewpoint. Still, from her 40 years as an outsider in China, Buck saw the inherent problems of a child who was different from everyone else. What happened with her in later 1948, the stigma of the biracial child ended up on her doorstep one day after New Year, before Christmas, in the form of a child that was Black and Indian, I believe, and neither family, neither culture would support that child. That child went on to become the president of Pearl Buck International. He just retired from that a few years ago. Okay. Michener's loneliness, Michener's social identity came from the fact that he was illegitimate and poor in a town and very intelligent, which did not honor his mother. He didn't know who his mother was until just shortly before her death. So he carried this sense of being an outsider with him. Going along with the pictures in the stories, of Hammerstein. In South Pacific, you have many examples of racial prejudice, labeling Liat, and you have Bloody Mary, who is certainly a character of her own story. The final one came with Flower Drum Song, which came in the late 50s. I didn't mention Anna and the King in Siam. I figured you all knew the prejudices there. The first song that Mei Li sings is 100 Million Miracles. Hammerstein's lyric set the tone for a blending of the Asian values with the practicality of American values of optimism. As a singer who claims miracles are happening every day, such as when a little girl in Chongqing, just 30 inches tall, decides that she will try to walk and nearly doesn't fall. That story has in it, it's not a very popular one, Americanized Chinese who arranged for a bride to be shipped in. She turns out to be a flower drum singer, much like Lotus in the Good Earth. And the people, the father, is forced to admit that she will not make a good wife for an American Chinese until she become Americanized, which she does in the end. And the final thing is, in his songs, the end of the 100 Million Miracles, Mei Ling sings, when an idle poet put words upon a page, writes upon a page with his brush, a musical friend writes the notes to blend, suggested by an idle thrush. Then a young soprano reads what they wrote, learns every note, every word, puts all they wrote in her lovely throat, and suddenly a song is heard. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you defeat prejudice. Short version.